You're travelling to the next village over, following the dirt path until you reach the crossroads by the stream. But today, there's something off. The stench of death lingers in the air. You see something nearby laying on the muddy bank, a carcass of some kind, mangled beyond recognition. Suddenly, you hear heavy footsteps squelching through the mud. Your gut tells you to hide, so you get low, ducking behind a wall for cover. You peer over in time to see a hulking creature approaching the corpse, as ugly as it is terribly strong. The creature stops next to the body and crouches, beginning to tear apart chunks of bloody flesh and throw them into its drooling maw, chewing like a beast. Then it stops and begins to sniff. You tense, trying to figure out what to do, but it doesn't matter. It's too late. As soon as the troll caught a whiff of you, it was all over. Hi, welcome back to From Mythos to Monsters, the podcast where I delve into the mythologies behind fantasy's most beloved creatures to see where they came from. Before we start, I'd just like to remind everyone that patrons of mine now have access to polls that will influence what the next topic of the podcast is. So if you're enjoying this series, please consider supporting it. If you could also take a second to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, that's a free but equally important way of supporting me as well. Thank you. Now, today's topic is the troll, a concept originating in ancient Scandinavia which greatly changed over the centuries. Whether you prefer it as a giant hulking brute or a tiny creature with fuzzy hair, believe it or not, both depictions are kind of equally valid. To find out why, let's go back to the days of Old Norse, when Odin still ruled over the snowy lands of northern Europe. In Nordic folklore, the troll was originally not a single creature, but a descriptor that could be used for any creature with supernatural abilities. The word came from the Old Norse word trollgeri, which vaguely meant something magical or supernatural. What the Norse exactly meant when they used the word is a difficult subject to unravel, since there's a great deal of confusion and overlap in use of the terms Jotun, troll, thurs, and risi, which can all describe various creatures. Generally, in Old Norse stories, the Jotun were gigantic primordial beings personifying nature, while trolls were usually more solitary adversaries, living in isolated locations like mountains or caves, and people who used magic, such as witches. However, even these ideas could overlap. For example, if a Jotun was evil or scary, it could also be described as a troll. Another interesting thing to note is that Norse mythology is likely what inspired the later ideas of trolls turning to stone during sunlight, since this idea can be traced back to the story from the Prose Edda, I told you this would come back up, where Thor keeps a dwarf talking for so long that the sun comes up and the dwarf turns to stone. To be fair, we've all had late night chats like that though, haven't we? Over time, however, the term troll became less of a vague attribute and more of a creature in its own right. Yet the idea of what it looked like varied hugely depending on what part of Scandinavia you were in. To the south, in modern-day Denmark, for example, trolls were thought to be much smaller creatures, similar to elves and those ugly little dolls that you used to see in the 90s. That kind of depiction of the troll has been kept alive by pop singers like Justin Timberlake in animated films, although I can't help but feel it might have just been better off dying. The further north you go, however, the larger trolls begin to get, until you get to the point where trolls are being described as large as mountains. Now, these giant trolls weren't necessarily evil. They could just as easily be helpful as they could dangerous, and could even look like humans. But that all changed when Christianity arrived in Scandinavia. You see, Christians didn't like the idea of the troll, probably because it represented ideas from older religions like Old Norse, which they sought to erase. So, The church demonized trolls, painting them as godless beasts, and heretical traits began to popularly be assigned to them, like the idea that they hated Christians and could smell them from far away, or that they would hurl boulders at churches, yet somehow always miss. Even today, the presence of large boulders in Scandinavian landscapes are often attributed to trolls having thrown them there, or to being the actual body of a troll that has been turned to stone by the sun. In Christian Scandinavia, folklore surrounding trolls continued to be developed, but now they were almost always the antagonists of the stories they were in. They were depicted as ugly and dim-witted, and also often ancient and strong. Trolls had become man-eating monsters, and stories about them used tropes that were popular in many other fairy tales, like kidnapping princesses or being defeated by the cunning hero. One such story revolves around Askeladdin, a Norwegian character featured in many folktales who outsmarted a troll by challenging it to an eating competition and tricking it into carving out its own stomach. Another widely popular children's tale that even I was told as a kid was about 3 goats who had to pass over a bridge guarded by a troll in order to reach food. When the first and smallest goat arrives, it tells the troll that the next goat is bigger. The second goat does the same until the third and largest goat arrives and headbutts the troll, sending it downriver. God, that third goat must have been an absolute monster himself. I can see why we refer to impressive people as being the goat. Folktales like these shaped the popular idea of the troll as being a brutish but dim-witted foe who's usually only concerned with where to get their next meal. And this idea continued into the 20th century with the emergence of fantasy as a popular genre. Now, I would say that the first major instance of the troll appearing in popular culture was in 1937, with the release of a little book called The Hobbit. Yep, it only took 5 episodes, but we're finally talking about J.R.R. Tolkien. Rejoice. Now, in The Hobbit, 3 trolls named Bill, Tom and Bert capture the protagonists and threaten to cook and eat them. They are saved, however, by the wizard Gandalf, who impersonates one of the trolls to start infighting between them. The trolls continue bickering until dawn, when the sun comes up and they turn into stone. Now, despite the slightly problematic classist undertones of their personalities, Tolkien incorporates the actual mythologies behind trolls pretty nicely with these 3 characters. They're large and powerful, but ultimately dim-witted. They're motivated by hunger, and the main vulnerability they have is the sun. That's all consistent with Scandinavian folktales and myth. Tolkien was no doubt primarily motivated by fairy tales when writing this chapter, and we can see that because his drawing of the scene that he did is a direct parallel to an illustration from Hansel and Gretel. Yet despite this being a beloved part of the story, when Tolkien went on to write the Lord of the Rings trilogy, his depiction of trolls in The Hobbit did not sit well with him at all. You see, Tolkien was a Roman Catholic, and he felt that by giving the 3 trolls in The Hobbit the ability to speak human language, he was indirectly implying that they might have souls. This would be a direct contradiction to the church's idea of trolls, which is that they were godless, heathenous monsters. Therefore, in his later works in Middle-earth, Tolkien drew back from the idea of trolls as being even remotely intelligent. Henceforth, they were instead depicted as being much more beast-like. Trolls initially began as a mindless species, but were given some semblance of intelligence by Sauron so that he could use them for his own evil purposes. You might wonder why characters like Sauron and Saruman were allowed to be portrayed as intelligent, but creatures like orcs and trolls weren't. Well, while Sauron and Saruman did have souls, those souls had been corrupted by evil, which is not a heretical notion. By the Third Age, when the Lord of the Rings is set, the trolls we see throughout the majority of the story are called Ologhai, a specially bred race of trolls who could tolerate sunlight and who rarely spoke, and if they did speak, used only the blasphemous black speech of Mordor. The Ologhai were a convenient solution for Tolkien, allowing him to simultaneously change his trolls so that they aligned with Christian ideals, and could also be present in important scenes without being constantly thwarted by the sun. Ultimately, I think that being forced to work within the confines of Christian morality meant that Tolkien's trolls unfortunately lost a lot of their charm. While they are still cool, I think it's a shame that they essentially became simplified shadows of their former selves. Well, sorry for ranting so long about Middle-earth. I wish I could promise that it won't happen again. It almost certainly will. Trolls saw another resurgence in popularity thanks to Dungeons & Dragons, appearing in the game's original edition in 1974. So, since Gygax was shameless in stealing things from Middle-earth to repurpose for D&D, which version of Tolkien's troll did he go for? Well, in typical Gygax fashion, he took a completely unexpected and incomprehensible route. Because you see, his trolls weren't inspired by Tolkien at all, but by the American fantasy book Free Hearts and Free Lions, written by Paul Anderson and published in 1964. If you were to ask me why Gygax stole so much from Tolkien to the point where he got sued by his estate, and yet his trolls, which were so iconic in books like The Hobbit, were instead taken from a story that and I imagine most people, have never even heard of, I couldn't give you an answer. It's really fucking random. Well, anyway, in Anderson's story, the troll is described as perhaps 8 feet tall, perhaps more. His forward stoop, with arms dangling past thick claw-footed legs to the ground, made it hard to tell. The hairless green skin moved upon its body. His head was a gash of a mouth, a yard-long nose, and 2 eyes which were black pools, without pupil or white, eyes which drank the feeble torchlight and never gave back a gleam. Like a huge green spider, the troll's severed hand ran on its fingers, across the mounded floor, up onto a log with one taloned forefinger to hook it over the bark. Down again it scrambled until it found the cut wrist, and there it grew fast. The troll's smashed head seethed and knit together. He clambered back on his feet and grinned at them. Now, the reason I gave you that whole passage was because it's quite interesting. This is the first time we see the idea of trolls being able to regenerate. This trait is almost completely baseless from a mythological perspective, and yet has become arguably the most iconic part of D&D's trolls. You see, in Dungeons & Dragons, the troll is able to quickly heal wounds made from cuts, slashes, or even dismemberment. The only thing that could prevent this was decapitating it or subjecting it to acid or fire. In their appearance as well, D&D's trolls are green-skinned, lanky monsters with fearsome dispositions and an insatiable hunger. One of their only remaining connections to Norse mythology is the fact that they are classified as giants, probably because of their mythological relation to the Jotun. Otherwise, you can see how much Gygax took from Anderson's novel. Well, while I think there is an allure to D&D's trolls, and I do like the fact that they can regenerate, I really dislike how much they've distanced themselves from their roots. I mean, they may as well be called something completely different. RPG author Graeme Davis considers Dungeons & Dragons to be a major factor in the modern perception of giants and trolls as being regarded as very different creatures, and I think that indicates just how much they've strayed from their origins. Personally, I would depict trolls very differently to D&D, in a way I feel is much more faithful to the myths and folktales that inspired them. I would have the troll be a species that came in a variety of shapes and sizes, depending on the region you were in, harkening back to the way it was interpreted differently across Scandinavia. As opposed to being regenerating savage beasts, they would be furtive creatures that roamed at night or dwelt in caves, hiding from the rays of the sun that would turn them to stone until night fell once more. The further north you travelled, the larger the trolls would become, and I would justify that by saying long periods without sunlight in the subarctic lands would allow their growth to be unhampered by being constantly petrified. I would also have the trolls be memories of old traditions or faiths that mankind once followed, but which the modern world now condemns and tries to erase, similar to the way the Christian Church demonised them because of their association to Old Norse religious beliefs and culture. This would paint the troll as more of a tragic and persecuted monster than one that is inherently evil. Certainly, the oppression they have faced and the isolation they are forced to endure might make some of them violent or antisocial, but the same could be said for anyone that's been ostracised from society. Wow, I've been talking for so long that the sun is coming up. Oh no. Alright, well, that was certainly a longer episode than usual, but I hope you'll agree that this ancient and fascinating creature deserves it. Once again, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, I would really appreciate it. And just a reminder that if you want to support and influence the direction of the podcast, you can do so over on my Patreon. Alright, take care.